Good evening. Welcome to Kenya News Update today. For the next 12 minutes, we're diving into a provocative and urgent question. Is it time for the world to boycott the United States? Under President Donald Trump's second administration, which began in January 2025, the U.S. has pursued policies that critics argue violate international norms, escalate global tensions, and undermine the very rules-based order it helped create. But is a global boycott a realistic or even responsible response? Tonight, we'll examine the arguments for and against, explore what such a boycott might look like, and consider the profound implications for nations like Kenya and the wider world. We'll hear from analysts, economists, and political scientists. This is a debate about power, accountability, and the future of global governance. Let's begin. Our first perspective comes from those who argue the case is clear and compelling. They point to a pattern of behavior over the last year that they describe as reckless and unaccountable. The cornerstone of their argument is what they call the sanctions hypocrisy. The United States, more than any other nation, employs economic sanctions as a primary tool of foreign policy. According to data from the Treasury Department, the U.S. currently maintains comprehensive sanctions regimes against at least 7 countries, including Iran, Syria, and North Korea, and targeted sanctions on entities in over 20 others. These measures are justified as necessary to punish bad behavior and force compliance with international law. Yet, critics ask, who holds the United States accountable when it is perceived to break those same laws? The argument, prominently made in a recent Al Jazeera commentary, titled "It's Time for the World to Boycott the U.S., is that under President Trump, America is escalating violence abroad and repression at home while facing none of the sanctions routinely demanded of other states. They cite several key examples. First, the continued and arguably expanded use of drone strikes outside declared war zones, with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism reporting a 60% increase in reported strikes in Somalia and Yemen in the first 9 months of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024. Second, the withdrawal from or undermining of international treaties, from the Paris Climate Accords to the New START nuclear arms treaty with Russia. Third, what they term sham negotiations on Ukraine, where U.S. involvement is seen as prioritizing a deal that benefits Russia over Ukrainian sovereignty and European security. This perspective argues that traditional diplomatic protests are ineffective. The UN Security Council is paralyzed by the U.S. veto. International courts lack enforcement power against a superpower. Therefore, they propose a coordinated global campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, a BDS movement aimed at the United States itself. This wouldn't be a consumer boycott of Coca-Cola, they clarify, but a strategic state-led effort. It could involve nations collectively reducing their holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, which currently stand at over $7.6 trillion held by foreign entities. It could mean prioritizing trade deals that exclude the U.S., or creating alternative financial messaging systems to bypass the dominant SWIFT network, which the U.S. can weaponize through sanctions. The goal, they say, is not to collapse the American economy, but to impose a tangible cost for actions that destabilize the world, forcing a recalculation in Washington. Now, let's hear the counter-argument. Opponents of a boycott call the idea economically catastrophic and politically naive. They start with a simple number, 25%. That's the approximate share of global GDP represented by the United States. It is the world's largest consumer market, the issuer of the global reserve currency, and the central node in countless supply chains. For a country like Kenya, the economic ties are deep. The U.S. is a major destination for Kenyan agricultural exports like coffee and cut flowers, a source of tourism revenue, and a critical partner in health initiatives like PEPFAR. A deliberate severing of these ties would cause immediate and severe hardship. Furthermore, they argue, the concept of a unified global boycott is a fantasy. The world is not monolithic. It's a landscape of competing interests. While European nations may chafe at U.S. trade policies, their security is inextricably linked to NATO, which remains underpinned by American military power. Gulf states rely on U.S. security guarantees against Iran. In Asia, nations like Japan and South Korea balance their economic relationship with China against their security alliance with Washington. The idea that these diverse actors would harmoniously coordinate to undermine their own economic and security interests is, critics say, divorced from geopolitical reality. They point to the failed attempt to isolate Russia after its invasion of Ukraine as a precedent. While sanctions were imposed, A true global boycott never materialized, with China, India, and many others increasing their trade. There's also a philosophical objection. Proponents of the liberal international order, even those critical of current U.S. policy, argue that the system of rules, institutions, and alliances built since World War II, though imperfect, has prevented great power war and facilitated unprecedented global growth. Undermining the central pillar of that system, the United States, through a boycott could lead not to a more accountable America, but to a chaotic, multipolar free for all where might makes right. Would a world where China or Russia sets the terms be more just or stable? This camp argues for engagement, diplomacy, and strengthening multilateral institutions from within, not for a punitive rupture that could unleash greater instability. Let's examine what a boycott might practically entail, moving from theory to potential practice. If we consider it as a spectrum of actions, the mildest form could be diplomatic. We've already seen glimpses, the freezing of high-level dialogues, recalls of ambassadors for consultations, and symbolic votes against the U.S. in the UN General Assembly. In 2025, the General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the U.S. tariff policy with a record 148 votes in favor, a powerful statement of global opinion, but one with little material effect. The next level is financial. This is where numbers become crucial. Foreign holders, primarily central banks and governments, own about 30% of the U.S. national debt. If a coalition of nations began to slowly divest from treasury bonds, it could drive up U.S. borrowing costs. However, this is a double-edged sword. China, the second largest foreign holder with over $800 billion in treasuries, would see the value of its own holdings plummet if it triggered a sell-off. It's a mutually assured financial destruction. A more feasible step might be the accelerated development of regional alternatives. The European Union has long sought to bolster the euro's international role, and the BRICS nations are experimenting with currency arrangements to settle trade without dollars. But the dollar's dominance, rooted in decades of trust and deep, liquid markets, is a formidable moat. Then there's trade. Here, the tool is tariffs and quotas, but again, the interdependence is staggering. The U.S. is Kenya's third largest export destination. In 2024, Kenya exported goods worth approximately $450 million to the U.S. A boycott would directly threaten thousands of Kenyan jobs in the horticulture and textile sectors. Conversely, the U.S. exports critical technology, pharmaceuticals, and aircraft to the world. Disrupting these flows would cause global supply chain seizures. The digital realm adds another layer. U.S. tech giants, Google, Meta, Apple, Microsoft, form the backbone of the global internet. A true technological boycott is almost inconceivable for most modern economies. This brings us to a critical case study, the global response to climate change. The U.S., under President Trump, has formally withdrawn from the Paris Agreement for a second time. It has also rolled back domestic emissions regulations and championed fossil fuel expansion. This is a clear example of a U.S. policy that imposes a cost on the entire planet. The boycott argument here is potent. Why should other nations bear the burden of reducing emissions if the world's second largest polluter abdicates responsibility? Some advocates suggest a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a tariff on U.S. goods based on their carbon footprint, not as a boycott per se, but as a targeted economic measure to level the playing field and incentivize change. The European Union is already implementing such a system, and it could indirectly serve as a model for holding the U.S. economically accountable for its climate inaction. But let's pivot to consider an alternative future, one not of boycott but of adaptation and new alliances. While the debate about the U.S. rages, other nations are not standing still. They are innovating and forming new partnerships. Consider the news from the world of technology. Just recently, the Indian robotics company Adverb unveiled Elixis W, its first made-in-India wheeled humanoid robot designed for industrial shop floors. This isn't just a product launch. It's a symbol of the global diffusion of high-tech capability. It represents physical AI and adaptive automation, sectors once dominated by US, Japanese, and German firms. India's push into advanced robotics, supported by government, Make in India policies, shows how nations are building self-reliance in critical technologies, reducing their vulnerability to the policies of any single country, including the US. This technological decentralization is part of a broader trend, the slow, uneven move toward a multipolar world. In this emerging landscape, middle powers like Kenya have more room to maneuver. The key is strategic diversification. For Kenya, this means deepening economic ties within the African Continental Free Trade Area, strengthening partnerships with the European Union, and engaging pragmatically with China's Belt and Road Initiative, all while maintaining a functional relationship with the United States. It's a complex balancing act, but it's the reality of 21st century geopolitics. The goal isn't to pick a side in a new Cold War, but to build resilience and agency by having multiple options. So, where does this leave us? The call for a boycott of the United States is a powerful rhetorical device that highlights a genuine and dangerous democratic deficit in global governance. The world lacks effective mechanisms to check the power of its most powerful state. The anger and frustration behind the call are real and justified for many around the world who see U.S. actions as destabilizing. However, a full-scale, coordinated global boycott remains unlikely in the extreme. The economic interdependence is too deep, the geopolitical alternatives are too uncertain, and the collective action problem is too immense. The more probable path forward is a messy, incremental, and uneven process of what we might call strategic distancing. We will see more regional integration blocks that exclude the U.S. We will see more efforts to create non-dollar financial channels for critical trade, like energy and food. We will see more nations, inspired by India's robotics example or Kenya's own tech hub ambitions, investing in strategic autonomy. And we will see continued diplomatic pressure through votes, alliances of the willing, and public shaming in international forums. The United States will likely remain the single most powerful nation, but its ability to set the global agenda unilaterally will continue to erode, not because of a formal boycott, but because of 1,000 smaller decisions made in capitals from Nairobi to New Delhi to Berlin, decisions aimed at building a world less reliant on any one center of power. For Kenya and Africa, the lesson is one of agency and opportunity. The current global turbulence is a risk, but also a chance to redefine relationships on more equitable terms. The conversation must move beyond simply for or against America. It must focus on building domestic capacity, strengthening continental unity, and engaging with all partners based on clear national interests. The era of unquestioned alignment is over. The future belongs to the agile, the diversified, and the strategically sovereign. The debate about boycotting the U.S. is, in the end, a debate about how the rest of the world grows up and steps into its own power. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to Kenya News Update today.